2 days. That's all I was gone. 48 hours at a cattle auction over in Benton County. And somehow that was enough time for a group of people I'd barely spoken to in 3 years to decide they knew what to do with a piece of land my family had owned for nearly 4 decades. When I pulled my truck off County Road 18 and headed toward my south pasture, I honestly thought I had made a wrong turn. I slowed down, looked around, checked the mailbox, then looked again. Everything felt familiar and wrong at the same time. The oak trees were still there. The drainage ditch was still there. The old windmill on the hill was still spinning. But running across the middle of my pasture was a brand new white vinyl fence that absolutely had not been there when I left. I just sat there for a second with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at it. You ever have one of those moments where your brain refuses to process what your eyes are seeing? That was me. Because fences don't just appear overnight. Especially not expensive ones. Especially not on somebody else's land. My name's Caleb Mercer. I own 41 acres outside a small town called Ashford Falls. My dad bought the place in the late 80s, and after he passed, I took over. Most of the land isn't fancy. Rolling grass, a couple barns, some cattle, enough equipment to keep me busy and enough repairs to keep me humble. The south pasture was one of the best sections of the property. Every spring I'd rotate cattle through there because the grass came in thick and healthy. There was also an old dirt access lane running through part of it, something I'd built years ago to move hay trucks and equipment between fields. Nothing glamorous, but useful. Very useful, as it turned out. The subdivision behind my property was newer. Cedar Ridge Preserve. 3 years old. One of those planned communities where every house looks like it came from the same catalog and every mailbox is exactly the same height. Security cameras on every corner. HOA newsletters. Community rules. Perfect sidewalks. Perfect landscaping. Perfect opinions about everything. Now don't get me wrong, I don't automatically hate HOAs. Some folks like structure. Some folks like rules. That's their business. But from the day Cedar Ridge went up, there was always this feeling that a few people over there looked at my ranch like it was unfinished scenery. Like I was some temporary inconvenience standing between them and a prettier view. I got out of my truck and walked toward the fence. Fresh posts. Fresh concrete. Brand new signs attached every 20 feet. Private community boundary. No trespassing. Residents only. I remember laughing once. Just one short laugh. Not because it was funny, but because if I didn't laugh, I was probably going to start yelling. Then I noticed an envelope sticking out of my mailbox. No stamp. Hand delivered. The letter inside explained everything and somehow made it worse. According to the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, they had determined that the area beyond their previous boundary served as an unused buffer zone and that extending the fence line would improve resident safety, traffic management, and overall property values. I must have read that sentence 5 times. Unused buffer zone. That was their description of my pasture. Land that fed my cattle every year. Land listed on my deed. Land surveyed twice in the last decade. They wrote about it like it was an abandoned patch of weeds nobody cared about. The more I read, the hotter I got. But underneath the anger was something else. Curiosity. Because nobody makes a move this bold without convincing themselves they're right. So I grabbed my survey records from the house and drove down the entire fence line. That's when the scale of it hit me. They weren't close to the property line. They weren't even in the same neighborhood as the property line. Their fence sat roughly 120 feet inside my land. 120 feet. That isn't a mistake. That's a decision. That's somebody looking at a map and deciding ownership is optional. I kept driving and eventually reached the far end of the pasture where the old dirt access road curved around a stand of cedar trees. That's when I saw the second surprise. Gravel. Fresh gravel. And parked on top of that gravel were rows of vehicles. SUVs. Pickup trucks. Sedans. At least 30 of them. My first thought was that some event must be happening. Then I realized where they were parked. They were parked on my land. Not beside it. Not near it. On it. Somebody had actually built an overflow parking area on my pasture. I sat there watching people walk back toward the subdivision carrying grocery bags and coffee cups, completely unaware they were crossing private property. And then the final piece clicked into place. The dirt lane I'd built years ago wasn't just useful anymore. It was their only practical way in and out of that parking area. Every single vehicle sitting there depended on access across my land. I leaned back against my truck and stared at the scene. Most people probably expected me to storm into an HOA meeting. Maybe hire a lawyer immediately. Maybe start screaming at somebody. But the funny thing about working cattle for most of your life is that you learn something valuable. When an animal runs into a fence, it panics. When a person runs into a fence, they usually reveal exactly who they are. And standing there in that pasture, looking at 30 cars parked where my cattle should have been grazing, I suddenly had an idea. A very simple idea. One that involved some steel livestock panels sitting in my barn. One that didn't require an argument. One that didn't require permission. And by the time the sun started dropping behind the hills, I was already putting that plan into motion. I drove back to the barn with that idea rolling around in my head the entire way. And the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. Not because it was revenge, at least not entirely. It was because for the first time since reading that ridiculous letter, I could see a way to make my point without shouting, threatening, or spending 6 months buried in legal paperwork. Sitting inside the equipment shed were about 24 steel livestock panels I'd accumulated over the years. Some were newer, some had dents and scratches from seasons of use, but every one of them was solid. Next to them sat my skid steer. I remember standing there looking at both and thinking, well, gentlemen, looks like we've got work to do. The first panel went up around 3 in the afternoon. Then another. Then another. I wasn't rushing. That's the funny part. People always imagine these stories happening in a blaze of anger, but I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. There is a difference. By 4 o'clock, I had blocked the east entrance. By 5, I had sealed the south side. By 6, I was chaining panels together around the remaining openings. Every connection got a heavy lock. Every corner got reinforced. I wasn't building a trap. The trap already existed. I was simply acknowledging its boundaries. The last thing I did before heading home was walk the perimeter one final time. The vehicles were all still there. Families were inside their houses eating dinner. Kids were riding bicycles. Nobody had any idea what tomorrow morning was going to look like. I slept surprisingly well that night. Maybe because I knew I hadn't touched anyone's property. Maybe because I knew every inch of ground involved belonged to me. Or maybe because deep down I was curious how people who ignored boundaries would react once they encountered one. My answer arrived at 6:12 the next morning. The first phone call woke me up. I ignored it. Then another. Then another. By the time I poured my coffee, there were 11 missed calls and 6 voicemails. Half of them sounded confused. The other half sounded furious. By 7 o'clock, my phone was vibrating so often it looked possessed. I finally answered one. Mr. Mercer? A woman snapped before I could even say hello. There are residents trapped in the overflow lot. Interesting, I replied. How'd they get in there? Silence. Then, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Actually, I do. Click. She hung up. The calls kept coming. HOA board members. Residents. Somebody claiming to be a property consultant. One man informed me I was illegally imprisoning vehicles. Another threatened lawsuits. A third said I was creating a public safety hazard. I listened politely, then emailed every one of them the same package. Property survey. Recorded deed. Photographs. County records. Measurements. Dates. Everything. No commentary. Just facts. Around mid-morning I got my first visit. A black SUV came flying down my driveway, throwing dust everywhere. Out stepped a woman named Vanessa Crow, president of the Cedar Ridge HOA. I knew who she was because she'd introduced herself once during a county meeting. She was the type of person who smiled while explaining why somebody else needed to change their behavior. That smile was gone now. She marched across the yard like she was leading an invasion. This is outrageous, she shouted before she even reached me. People can't get their vehicles. I took a sip of coffee. That's unfortunate. Unfortunate, she repeated. You've blocked emergency access. No, I said calmly. You built a parking lot on my pasture. That area was designated community space. By whom? By the board. I couldn't help laughing. Vanessa, the board can't designate my land any more than I can designate your living room. Her face turned red. You're creating enormous liability for yourself. I pointed toward the pasture. You built the fence first. I just finished the enclosure. For a moment I thought she might explode. Instead she spun around and stormed back toward her SUV. As she left, she yelled over her shoulder, "This isn't over." The thing was, she was right. It wasn't over. Not even close. By afternoon, the situation had become a circus. Residents were gathering near the fence taking pictures. Some were angry. Some looked embarrassed. A few seemed genuinely amused. One older gentleman actually walked over and introduced himself. His name was Walter. He lowered his voice and said, "For what it's worth, I voted against that fence." I appreciated that. Then he glanced toward the trapped vehicles and grinned. "Still wish I'd brought popcorn." News spread through town fast. Small towns are like that. By dinner, people were discussing the situation in diners, feed stores, barber shops, church parking lots, and online groups. Somebody posted drone footage. Somebody else uploaded screenshots of the HOA letter. The comments became a battlefield. Half the internet declared me a folk hero. The other half claimed I should compromise for the good of the community. Funny how often compromise means the property owner gives something up. Day 2 hit Cedar Ridge much harder than Day 1. The novelty wore off. Now people had practical problems. Several residents couldn't reach vehicles they needed for work. Delivery drivers were getting redirected. A landscaping crew showed up and immediately left after realizing they couldn't access equipment stored in the lot. At one point, a tow truck arrived, supposedly hired to remove my barriers. The driver took one look at the survey paperwork, shook his head, and drove away. That may have been my favorite moment of the entire week. Around lunchtime, I received a call from a county council member named Richard Hale. Unlike everyone else, he sounded calm. "Caleb," he said, "help me understand what's happening." So I did. I walked him through everything from the fence construction to the parking lot. There was a long pause when I finished. Then he sighed. "They really built all that without permission? Every bit of it. That's bold. That's one word for it." He chuckled. "I'll make some calls." By that evening, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Residents packed the room. I know because several attendees later told me exactly what happened. Apparently, people who had supported the fence suddenly wanted explanations. Homeowners started asking uncomfortable questions. Who approved the project? Was a survey completed? Did anyone verify the property line? Why was community money spent on improvements outside HOA land? The answers were apparently not impressive. Meanwhile, local media discovered the story. The headline that appeared the next morning made me laugh so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. "Rancher locks down HOA parking area during property dispute." The article included photographs of the fence, the trapped vehicles, and a county map showing exactly where the real boundary sat. Once that article spread, public opinion shifted dramatically. Suddenly, this wasn't a stubborn rancher causing trouble. It was an HOA that appeared to have annexed part of a neighbor's pasture because they thought nobody would stop them. By the third morning, tension was everywhere. You could feel it in every phone call, every email, every conversation. Then a sheriff's deputy arrived. Not because anyone had broken the law, but because enough complaints had been filed that somebody needed to review the situation. Deputy Aaron Mitchell stepped out of his cruiser carrying a folder under one arm. Nice guy, professional, patient. He spent nearly 2 hours reviewing records, examining surveys, and walking the property. Eventually, Vanessa arrived too, accompanied by 2 board members and an attorney who looked increasingly unhappy the longer he listened. We all stood near the disputed fence line while the deputy reviewed his findings. Finally, he closed the folder. "The surveyed boundary appears clear," he said. "The ownership records appear clear. This is a civil matter." Vanessa immediately protested. "But he's restricting access." The deputy shrugged. "Access to vehicles located on his property." The attorney quietly rubbed his forehead. That was the moment everything changed. Because for the first time, the HOA leadership realized nobody was coming to rescue them. No government agency was going to override property records. No magical exception was going to appear. They had built a fence on land they didn't own, and now everyone knew it. Late that afternoon, I received a call requesting a formal meeting. Not a demand, not a threat, a request. And after everything that had happened, that single difference in tone told me exactly how nervous they had become. So the next morning, I drove into town and sat down across from the very people who had spent the last 3 days insisting they were right. What happened in that meeting would finally end the standoff. But not before a few uncomfortable truths got dragged into the light. The meeting took place in a conference room above a local insurance office, one of those bland spaces with beige walls, cheap coffee, and fluorescent lights that somehow make everybody look guilty. When I walked in, Vanessa was already there along with 2 board members, the HOA attorney, their property manager, and a mediator from the county. 3 days earlier, they had been talking to me like I was the problem. Now they looked like people trying to calculate how expensive their mistake was about to become. Nobody wasted time. The attorney cleared his throat and slid a folder across the table. "Mr. Mercer, we'd like to discuss a resolution." Funny how quickly the word resolution replaces liability once the facts become public. Over the next 2 hours, we went point by point through everything. The fence, the gravel lot, the unauthorized use of the access road, the damaged grazing area, the loss of pasture during spring rotation. Every item had a cost attached to it. Every cost had documentation. Every document had a date. I didn't need to exaggerate anything because reality was already doing the work for me. Eventually, the board agreed to remove the entire fence at their expense, restore the pasture, reseed the damaged areas, compensate me for lost grazing use, and most importantly, sign a permanent agreement stating that any future access across my property would require written permission. When the paperwork was finished, Vanessa sat back in her chair and looked exhausted. For a moment, she seemed less like an HOA president and more like somebody who had finally realized confidence and authority are not the same thing. As everyone gathered their documents, she surprised me by speaking quietly. "We honestly thought that section wasn't being used." I looked at her for a second before answering. "That's the thing about private property. Whether I'm using it today isn't what determines who owns it." She nodded. No argument. No speech. Just a nod. And somehow that felt more meaningful than all the shouting from earlier in the week. The next day, I unlocked the steel panels. Residents collected their vehicles. Most left without saying a word. A few waved. 1 or 2 actually apologized. Walter, the gentleman who wanted popcorn, drove past with his window down and yelled, "Best entertainment this town's had in years." I laughed and wished him a good day. Then the real work began. Contractors removed the white fence section by section. Truckloads of gravel disappeared. Damaged ground got leveled. Fresh grass seed was spread across the pasture. Within a few months, the scars started fading. By late summer, you could barely tell the parking area had ever existed. The cattle certainly didn't care. They went right back to grazing as if none of the drama had happened. Life on a ranch has a way of restoring perspective. Cows don't care about HOA politics. Fences don't care about social status. Property lines don't care how many committees vote against them. They simply exist. And if there's one lesson that whole experience reinforced, it's that reality eventually catches up with assumptions. About 6 months later, I happened to drive past Cedar Ridge on my way to town. The community looked exactly the same as always, except for one detail. The white fence was still there, but now it sat precisely where it should have from the beginning, directly on the legal boundary line. Not an inch farther. I slowed down for a moment and looked at it. Then I noticed something else. The residents were using a longer alternate access route that curved around the subdivision. It added several minutes to every trip. Expensive to build, inconvenient to use, entirely avoidable. Had they simply asked permission from the start, we probably could have worked something out. Maybe not, maybe so, but they never asked. They assumed. And assumptions can become very expensive when they cross a property line. Every now and then somebody brings up the story when I'm in town. Usually it starts with, "Hey Caleb, are you the guy who fenced in all those HOA cars?" Technically that's not what happened, but I've learned it's easier to smile than explain the details. The truth is, I never wanted a fight. I never wanted attention. I just wanted my pasture back. The strange part is that the whole thing left me thinking less about land and more about respect. Because this was never really about grass, fences, or parking spaces. It was about a group of people deciding that someone else's rights mattered less than their convenience. Once you start thinking that way, trouble isn't far behind. And that's why, if I had to do it all over again, I'd make the exact same decision. Not because it felt good to win, but because some lessons only stick when they become inconvenient. Now I'm curious what you think. Was I justified in locking down access to property that sat on my own land? Or should I have handled the situation differently and gone straight to court instead? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. Some say property rights are property rights, period. Others think there should have been more compromise before things escalated. I'd love to hear where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a boundary dispute, or a neighbor who thought the rules somehow didn't apply to them, share your story below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next story might make this one look simple.